All right, camera rolling. Let's check out this 1/3 grid screen. All right, now lights. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So this afternoon, it's a Sunday, August 11th, 2024. And for today's video, I'd like to show you something really awesome. I'd like to say that I haven't watched it yet, but I have. The reason is because I was going to watch this and do the recording at the same time, like watch it for the first time and have a real genuine reaction, but unfortunately I messed up the audio. See, I didn't have this earbud in, and when I was playing the audio through the speakers, it was having an echo because it was coming directly into OBS, my recording software, from the computer, but then also through the microphone, which is right out of the frame of the camera. So anyway, I have a really great video to show you today. It's called Mars Colony versus Space Colony by the Angry Astronaut. Now, the Angry Astronaut's been around for quite a while on YouTube. I've been following him for, I think, at least 4 years, maybe 5. And I haven't seen him really talk about space, like rotating space colonies before. I haven't seen him really talk about much of anything other than, Elon Musk's SpaceX and some of the other major contractors or NASA. But one thing I've always loved about Angry Astronaut is he's very frank. He's very genuine. He just calls it like he sees it. And when I saw that he had a video about Mars colonies versus space colonies, what he said space colonies, but he's basically talking about rotating space habitats. He wants to compare the difference between Mars colonies and space colonies. So without further ado, let's see what he has to say, okay?
Good afternoon. On today's Angry Bulletin, we are going to revisit a topic that I haven't talked about in quite some time, and that is Elon Musk's vision of the future on Mars and how that stacks up against his arch rival Jeff Bezos and his ideas of a colony built in the middle of Earth orbit called an O'Neill cylinder. Which concept is better? Which is more realistic?
So he said that the space colonies would be in Earth's orbit. So I guess he's directly comparing a Mars colony to an Earth orbit rotating space colony. But keep in mind, a rotating space colony does not necessarily have to be in Earth orbit. It could be in the moon's orbit. It could orbit around Mars, or it could orbit around the sun and basically follow Earth around the sun. So, honestly, I would like to see space colonies that orbit around the sun. To me, like that's the ideal. Find the perfect distance from the sun so they don't really need heat or air conditioning, and they get plenty of solar power. And anyway, so let's continue on and hear what Angry has to say.
And which one are we more likely to see in the near future, or are we unlikely to see either of these solutions, and are they just the dreams of overly ambitious and overly rich people who simply are looking far beyond what even they are capable of building? All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to the Angry Astronaut. Today, we are going to be departing from the rather unpleasant current affairs happening out in space, whether it be Starliner or the ISS being destroyed in the near future, all of those things, and instead, we're going to be talking about something a little bit more optimistic. That is to say, the prospects of human beings colonizing the solar system. And there are all kinds of scientists and social influencers, journalists, etc., who really seem determined to see to it that mankind never really gets to this point, to talk about how it's impossible or unpleasant, nobody's ever really going to want to do it, and after all, we should be focusing on our own planet and not talk about colonizing the solar system. I'm not going to go into great detail as to why all of these people are wrong. Suffice it to say that we have limited resources available here on Earth, resources that we are steadily destroying the environment in the process of exploiting. And if we were to instead exploit the resources of the asteroid belt, the rocky planets in our solar system, or even some of the moons of the Jovian worlds, that might be the best key to preserving the long-term value of our own planet. And this is something that Jeff Bezos actually concentrates on extensively in his ideas. But before
So I wanna just interject a little bit. So he mentioned like where you would get materials for building habitats, and I've seen videos recently that talk about mining the moon, and it's been on my mind, and I want to mention it to you that the moon has a direct relationship with Earth, and that Earth-Moon relationship has affected the way that humanity has evolved, and it has a drastic effect on all life on Earth. So the current mass of the moon, it needs to remain unchanged. The idea of mining things from the moon and sending them into orbit and then pushing them out to Earth, or using them for like rotating space colonies, I don't like the idea of using the moon. Not at all. I mean, we could start with the asteroid belt. We could use maybe Mars or Venus. Maybe Mars, maybe other planets, maybe the moons of Jupiter or Saturn. There's like 60 or 90. There's a ton of moons around other planets in our solar system. But we don't need to mine our moon. Like the exact amount of material that's always been on the moon should always stay. I mean, plus the Apollo missions, I guess we can keep that, but we shouldn't. Whatever we add to the moon, we should take away. And we shouldn't take away any more than the amount of mass that we add. Basically, we should try to keep it exactly the same.
Before we get to that, we're going to be quoting extensively from an article entitled, "We Put Elon Musk's Dream to Colonize Mars Up Against Jeff Bezos' Vision of Living in Space, and One is More Realistic." Let's find out which solution is the better one. One would think that given that this is an article published by the mainstream media, that Elon Musk is not going to fare very well. Well, we'll find out, and I'm going to be including a lot of my own personal opinions. So obviously we know that Musk has his sights set on Mars, saying that he wants to establish a permanent, self-sustaining human colony of 1 million people on the red planet by 2050. At this point, given Starship's current rate of advancement, that seems highly unlikely, but still, let's assume that it's possible that getting 1 million people to Mars is doable. We're not talking about the process of getting them there. We are instead talking about the prospect of them living there. Bezos is actually more ambitious. He wants to build gigantic space stations in Earth orbit and elsewhere that would allow 1 trillion humans to live throughout the solar system. Although he says he won't see them in his lifetime, Bezos founded Blue Origin specifically to do this, to export the human population, or at least a lot of the human population, and all of their damaging activities, such as heavy industry, mining, etc., and to put it out in space where it's not going to do any harm to our home planet. Now, both billionaires' aspirations come with major technical, scientific, and ethical hurdles, but according to experts in architecture, astrobiology, and artificial gravity and reproductive health, one vision of these two is more realistic. So first of all, let's talk about the construction barrier. Establishing habitats where humans can not only live but thrive is the biggest challenge in both billionaires' visions, and I would agree with this assessment. If you ask independent architect Anthony Longman which world is more feasible to build, Bezos' space stations are the way to go in the long run, because you can make them Earth-like more easily than an entire planet. As most of us know, Musk's long-term vision is to terraform Mars by giving it a thicker atmosphere with breathable oxygen and a protective magnetic field to shield it from harmful space radiation, so that one day humans could live on and explore Mars' surface like on Earth. Longman thinks transforming an entire planet is too challenging, which is why he says colonizing Mars is not a good idea. Bezos' space stations could be built to resemble Earth more easily, no massive terraforming being necessary. The scale Bezos envisions for these space stations, however, is unlike anything ever built. They would resemble a 70s concept that most of us are familiar with called O'Neill colonies, enormous cylinders measuring 20 miles or over 30 kilometers long and 4 miles or 6 kilometers wide that could hold 1 million people. Longman has his own concept for space habitats designed to house just 8,000 people. And while he thinks that building a massive station like what Bezos imagines is more realistic, it's too big to be feasible in the near term. Quote, "I'm not saying they won't be built, but I think it will probably be some hundreds of years before we're able to build anything at that scale. With that said, Bezos is still the winner of this round. Score Bezos 1, Musk 0. So far, so good. Mainstream media is doing what we would anticipate. But I'll tell you, we've got some surprises waiting. Now, the second challenge, aside from shelter, is having enough food. And by the way, what you're looking at right now is a clip from some footage that I use in a Patreon video that I made that exclusively dealt with growing food on Mars and some of the challenges that we would face in doing that. And if you're interested in joining my Patreon channel that has a steadily growing library, I'll be adding another video this week. Well, all the details are in the description. Okay, enough self-promotion. Let's talk about food, and let's also talk about the expert that Business Insider went to in order to try to get a verdict as to which scenario was best. It was astrobiologist Rebecca Goncalves who they consulted on this one, and they discovered that scientists have already grown a few crops on the International Space Station, including tomatoes and lettuce, but scaling up production to feed millions requires more research. According to Rebecca Goncalves, quote, "We need to develop these very safe, closed-loop, self-sufficient agricultural systems." And she thinks this will actually be easier on Mars than in space. And that's because a planet already has a surface where humans can grow food, she says. In space, you would have to build farms from scratch and likely need to venture out to mine water and minerals from asteroids. Mars, on the other hand, has soil and water ice on its surface, or just a little bit beneath its surface.
So what Angry just said, okay, so he's saying that Rebecca Goncalves was the expert hired by Business Insider, I think, to make a determination what's better, to colonize Mars or to build space colonies. And her response is that it's better to build colonies on Mars because it's an existing planet that has a surface, that has resources, But I think what's glaringly obvious here, and I have to disagree with apparently Angry Astronaut and Rebecca Gonclaves. If you build a rotating colony, even if it's just a simple, you know, a tether holding two starships together and they're spinning around in circles. I'm not 100% sure that exact design would work, but um, even if it's just a really small rotating, proof of concept station, they're going to fit it out with most of the resources needed. Like just like on the existing International Space Station. I mean, they have a certain amount of water that gets resupplied and gets, cycled out, but they have mechanical devices that can clean the water and reuse the water. And they can have floor space built up with good soil, not freaking Martian regolith. We're talking good soil, or Martian regolith turned into good soil. um, but and the other thing about this is if you have that on, let's say you used two starships tethered together and rotating, you would have separate decks. And those separate, I mean, let's say you had 8 or 10 decks. I don't know how many starships going to be able to hold. But you could have, say, 2, 3, 4 of those decks all, totally used for different kind of crops at different temperatures. To get that kind of square footage for planting crops, you'd have to have a huge permanent, Martian colony. You'd have to have big habitats. And you'd have to build it, launch it, get it over to Mars, slow it down, bring it down to the Martian surface, do all kind of work to like get it set up on Mars. You also have to send excavators, to smooth it out. I mean, come on. How is it really that much better to build, habitats on Mars that would grow crops? It's not. It's really not.
Lots of water, and lots of regolith, which can be converted into fertile soil with bacteria that we already have here on Earth and that could be introduced to a Martian environment. Or if you were concerned about contamination, all you'd have to do is actually bring the bacteria's enzymes in order to carry out that conversion. In the process, not only would you have fertile soil, but it would also produce breathable oxygen and rocket fuel as a byproduct. Again, if you're interested in all that, I've got a lot more details in the other video. But researchers have already made progress towards the goal of growing food in regolith because they've already grown it in lunar regolith, and Gonclaves is working to develop a closed-loop, self-sustaining agricultural system for Martian colonies. Quote, "If I had to pick a billionaire's vision of the future, I would definitely go with Elon Musk's Martian colony, and
He just gave the answer right there. Apparently, Rebecca Gonclaves is already working on some kind of program or project to develop Martian habitats that can grow plants. This is, of course, she's gonna say it's better to do it on Mars. She's already probably got funding to do to do this kind of project that she's trying to make it work. That just doesn't. I'm sorry, Angry. I gotta disagree with you on that.
completely agree with her. Out in space, you have to bring everything. the water. And assuming, of course, that you're growing it in a hydroponic sort of environment, maybe you don't need the soil, but you need to bring everything else out there. And yes, once you have a greenhouse established, ultimately it could become self-sufficient, utilizing waste material in order to get new fertilizer, etc. But it's so much easier if you already have that stuff available to you, especially the water. So now we need to talk about artificial gravity. Now, one would think that Bezos' solution would be the winner here because you can create a full G of artificial gravity out in space if you have a big enough station. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. As we all know, the human body doesn't adapt too well to low or zero gravity. Researchers have found that spending weeks to months in space can lead to muscle and bone loss, vision problems, and even kidney stones. This means that a space or Mars colony would need artificial gravity to keep its residents healthy. Mars has some built-in gravity already, about 38% of what we experience on Earth, but a space station would need to start from scratch. Now, I want to stop the article right here. We actually have no idea whatsoever as to what the effect of reduced gravity is going to be on the human body. We know how extreme things are when there's just microgravity, but 38% gravity? Really don't know. Is there going to be any muscle loss, any bone loss? And if so, how significant is that going to be when you...
So here, Angry's making a very important point that, well, on Mars, you only have about 38% gravity. That, we experience 1G here, you get 38% of that on Mars. So let's say it was better to build colonies for growing food on Mars, like building habitats and grow food on Mars. Let's say it was easier to do that than do it in rotating colonies in orbit. Who's going to eat the food? Angry, who's going to eat that food? How are you going to attract people to live there if it's 38% gravity? Now, it's true. We don't know exactly what it's like to live in pseudo-gravity. I mean, we know that it's going to be different to have rotating habitats. We know that the 1G gravity is not going to behave exactly the way we're used to on Earth. Just think of it, as soon as you pick up any object and throw it, it's going to behave differently. It's going to have Coriolis effect forces. So, again, I'm just not sold on the idea that Mars is a better place to build colonies, to build habitats or anything.
At least have some gravity affecting your body. We aren't going to know these things until we carry out some pretty extensive experiments in this kind of environment. And the only way to do that is to create about a 1/3 artificial gravity habitat. And currently, the only company that's building a space station designed to do just that is the Orbital Assembly Corporation. And frankly, they aren't making very huge progress when we're talking about building one of these space stations, at least within the next 10 years or so. They're very optimistic, and I'm actually impressed with some of their designs, but it's going to be a while before we really know what 1/3 gravity does to the human body. But let's just assume that the consequences are 1/3 as bad on Mars as they are out in space and in microgravity. There is no scientific reason to believe that, but let's say that that's the case. Well, there's a Rachel Seidler, who, by the way, is a professor of applied physiology and kinesiology at the University of Florida, who talks about the differences between natural gravity, even if it's just 1/3 of the way there, as opposed to artificial gravity. Quote, artificial gravity is thought to be very difficult to implement in space. Bezos's enormous 20-mile-long stations would rotate to simulate Earth's gravity, but getting that sort of Goliath up and running is really far-fetched. And keep in mind mind, artificial gravity is not exactly the same as real gravity. You're just using the centripetal force of a rotating space station in order to simulate that gravity. It really doesn't produce exactly the same effect. Are we going to be able to trick our bodies with centripetal force, or is this going to create a whole new collection of problems for people who spend months, years, or perhaps even their whole lives on space stations like an O'Neill cylinder? At this point, we really don't know. And since Mars has at least some gravity, these particular researchers, who the Business Insider talked to, felt that Mars was the better bet. And again, I tend to agree. But now we need to talk about the most difficult challenge of all, and that is in the field of reproduction. And by the way, just watching this takes me back. There was a moment of fear that my ex-wife and I had when our child was only about, I think, 3 months old. I don't really recall exactly. There was a moment where we thought the fetus might have been in danger, and so we had an early ultrasound done, something that most people don't get to do, and I saw this little creature just swimming around happily inside the womb. It's a magical moment that I'll never forget. Anyway, let's stop talking about that and let's start talking about what happens to fetuses on Mars or out in space. If we're going to establish a long-standing colony off-world, obviously reproduction will be necessary. Now, a Russian experiment in 2007 showed us that giving birth and conceiving in space is at least possible after a cockroach named Hope, funny name for a cockroach, birthed 33 baby roaches, and one of those roaches later conceived during the mission. However, as we all know, cockroaches aren't humans, well, most humans anyway, and a lot of questions remain around how space radiation and low gravity would affect a developing fetus, since we've never sent a pregnant person into space and likely won't for a long time given the potential risks. Even here on Earth in fully equipped hospitals, giving birth can be dangerous, obviously. So both Musk's Martian colony and Bezos' space stations would have to be equipped with healthcare systems identical to those on Earth, if not better, said Adam Watkins, professor of reproductive biology at the University of Nottingham. It's not clear to Watkins whether space stations or Mars cities would be a better place for giving birth. They may come with equal risk, because yes, again, even though in theory we can produce a full G of gravity on a space station, this is centripetal force. It's not real gravity. Is that going to have a different effect on a developing fetus than it would have here on Earth? We really don't know. Obviously, reduced gravity on Mars is going to have at least some effect, but again, we really don't know, and we won't know until we actually try. So what's the verdict? What does Watkins think about all this? Well, quote, I think establishment of human colonies on Mars is more likely to occur before we have significant human colonies established on large structures in space, and so therefore we are more likely to see human babies on Mars before we see them in space. That's kind of a cop-out in my opinion, so we're just going to go ahead and call that a tie. And by the way, for those of you keeping track,
I'm sorry, I just disagree. Okay, so look, we've already got the International Space Station. That is a semi-permanent, I guess. I mean, I guess you'd call it a semi-permanent because it's, you know, by the time it's burned up in the atmosphere, it will have been in space for like 30 years or something like that. So, I mean, it's a pretty permanent structure. So, permanent structures in space started with orbiting habitats, and they will continue to be more popular. I'm quite sure of it. I'm quite sure that's how you're going to see it play out in the future. The only people who will ever want to live on Mars are people who are getting paid to live there. Or on the moon. Nobody's going to want to live on Mars without getting paid to be there. That's just point blank. Like nobody. Like except for temporary, very temporary visitors, people there who are less than a year for sure. So, and habitats and colonies in orbit are going to continue to develop and develop at a much quicker pace than habitats on Mars. Watch. Watch. Because especially when they deorbit the ISS, there's going to be a gaping hole of demand for people who want to see a habitat in orbit after we've had one for so long. And no, the Chinese space station is not going to satisfy that urge, that demand for most Western civilization and culture. So, anyway, totally just unknown. Angry, I love your videos, man. But just we'll just agree to disagree on this one, I guess. All right. Well, there's still some left. Let's see what else you have to say in the next 3.5 minutes.
Musk is ahead 2-1. And by the way, this is where the Business Insider article comes to a conclusion. They, in their opinion, give Musk the win with 3 points to 1 as to having the most feasible colony. But that's a little disappointing. Are there not other factors that could really give a definitive victory to one side or the other? Well, in my opinion, absolutely. And that is the in situ factor. Out in space, there are no in situ resources at all. Yes, you can exploit the moon. Yes, you can exploit asteroids, but there is nothing where Bezos is planning to build these massive space cities that can be exploited. It's all empty space. At best, you're going to have to make use of the moon and the asteroids that don't have nearly as significant a gravity challenge as Earth does in order to realistically build something this colossal in low Earth orbit. Amazingly enough, it would actually be much easier to haul resources all the way from the asteroid belt to low Earth orbit rather than trying to haul them up to low Earth orbit from the Earth's surface, and that's simply because of gravity. The Earth's gravity is very strong, very difficult to overcome, and requires lots of power and lots of fuel in order to get there with any sort of substantial payload. Whereas Mars, most of the resources are right there. The metals, the regolith, which can be made into concrete, the water. And if you pile enough regolith on top of your habitat, or just build your habitat underground, you've got your radiation shielding as well. In my opinion, that gives Elon Musk's vision a clear advantage over Bezos's dream of building these massive O'Neill cylinder space stations. Now, could both of them be done? Absolutely. Should both of them be done? Absolutely. Yeah. But if we're talking about who's going to have the biggest challenge in trying to make something like this a reality, I think Elon's got the edge, as long as he can stay focused and keep his eyes on the prize. And remember that creating a second habitat, a backup world for our species to take advantage of should the worst happen to our civilization, which eventually it absolutely will. Well, Elon definitely has the edge. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. So he's and what Angry just said here was we should build a backup, place to live, and like as if you could move the population of Earth over to Mars. Like that's never going to happen unless you had a gazillion space elevators and tons of ships. It's just millions of ships. It's just ridiculous. What you could do is colonize the ocean surface. If you colonize the ocean surface on Earth, that makes a backup for humanity. That hedges our bets against the worst disasters other than a giant asteroid hitting those floating colonies on the ocean surface. Okay, I mean, I'm not against having colonies on Mars. I'm not against having colonies on the moon either. But let's be realistic. The right way to go is orbiting, rotating rotating and orbiting space habitats and space colonies. They're going to start with habitats that are going to be smaller, but they're going to grow and grow and grow. And some of those visions you saw on this video with giant O'Neill cylinders, it will happen someday. I am 150% convinced it will happen someday. Let's close it out with Angry Astronaut.
Much for watching. Really appreciate your support. Please like, please subscribe. Also, please check the description for various ways to support this content and also find out how to get access to my Patreon channel. And as always, stay angry about space.
I'm angry about space and colonizing the oceans.